This is the worst nightmare for any parent. Rodney Alcala and people like him are the reason why you can't send your kids walking to school alone.
In 2017, we interviewed Matt Murphy, the man who went toe-to-toe with serial killer Rodney Alcala in a California courtroom.
And he goes, Matt, called me Matt, I'm not violent. I'm not a violent guy. I'm in the weenie yard. I'm not with those guys. I'm not violent. This is a guy who raped and bashed the skull in of Georgia Wickstead. This is a guy who smashed the face in of Jill Parkham with a rock, and he's looking at me like, hey, buddy, I'm not violent. I'm not on that yard with those guys. I'm with the respectable guys on death row. After my closing argument, that's when he realized, after I pointed at him and called him the devil, he realized I wasn't his buddy.
Between 1977 and 1979, Rodney Alcala killed 4 women and a 12-year-old girl in Southern California. It's believed he murdered many more.
If a photograph of a missing young woman is in Rodney Alcala's storage locker, I guarantee they're dead. That he raped them, he murdered them, he tortured them, and they are dead. Given the volume of the photographs, we always knew that we had other victims. We didn't know who they were.
The charismatic killer would charm women into trusting him before brutally raping and killing them.
Well, Rodney Alcala is a highly intelligent, charming, psychopathic, murderous, torturous killer. Thank God the jury did the right thing, found him accountable, convicted him, and sentenced him to death. Matt Murphy, Senior Deputy District Attorney in the Homicide Unit of Orange County DA's office. Well, Rodney Alcala was a very well-known case in Orange County. It first came to me after it had been reversed again. So basically, he was tried in the very early 80s after the 1979 murder of Robin Samsoe. He was convicted, sentenced to death. The Rosebird Court reversed it. It landed on the desk of a guy named Tom Goethals, one of my predecessors. He tried it, convicted him again, got the death penalty again. Then it was reversed by the United States Ninth Circuit, and then it landed on my desk. So that's when I first got the case. Every death penalty case or capital case in California, we do what's called a bifurcated trial. So there's the guilt phase. The question is, did he do it? And then you have a whole separate trial on what is the appropriate punishment, and do the aggravating circumstances substantially outweigh the mitigating circumstances, and a jury has to decide whether or not the person deserves to die for what they did. So the court has the option in these things of just reversing the death penalty and allowing the conviction to stand. And that makes it much easier on the families. But the Rosebird Court didn't do that. They reversed the entire case. And the thing about it is, every time they do a reversal, they find evidence that they believe was improperly admitted. So essentially what they do is they gut the case. So it comes back down with way less evidence than it had in the original prosecution. So it's almost like an obstacle course set up by the appellate process. So when it came back the second time, Tom Goethals, who's now one of our Superior Court judges, he had less evidence to work with than the original prosecution. So when it went up to the Ninth Circuit, they did the same thing. They found certain items of evidence that were admitted in the second trial were improperly admitted, and they found that the defense lawyer should have run an alibi defense, and they made all these rulings that made it even tougher. So now it's been essentially twice gutted. So when it lands on our desk, when it came back in for the third time, we had far less evidence than they had in the original trial, if all that makes sense. Unfortunately, in California, it's not that rare. There's a lot of hostility towards the death penalty. So a lot of the cases haven't gotten to that stage of the appellate process yet, but yeah, nobody was necessarily surprised when it came back. The tough part about that, and what nobody thinks about, is there's a victim's family involved in this. And Robin Samsoe had a mother who loved her, and she had brothers who loved her, and she had friends who loved her. And every time the case gets reversed, you have to drag the family through this, and they have to go through the process again. And I don't think it's a stretch to say this ruined the life of this girl's poor mother. Rodney Alcala is one of those guys that when you look into his history, remember, he kidnapped and raped Tally Shapiro in 1968. So he literally, this is the don't take rides from a stranger guy. This is the worst nightmare for any parent. Rodney Alcala and people like him are the reason why you can't send your kids walking to school alone. I mean, and maybe you can in England. I hope you can in England. Here in Southern California, you really can't, because of guys like Rodney Alcala. So he kidnaps her, he rapes her, a Good Samaritan sees her get into his car, and it doesn't look right. And he follows the car to the house, and it doesn't look right. Now, this is 1968, so it's long before cell phones. He finds a payphone, calls it in, the police get there, and essentially they knock on the door. Rodney shows up naked and says, "Hey, I'll be right with you." He runs out the back naked. And the police officer, who's by himself, looks down, and it's one of those situations where it's save this bleeding little girl on the floor who's unconscious and very close to death. She was in a coma for 33 days after this happened. So it's save the little girl or catch the bad guy running out of the back. And he did the right thing. He saved the little girl. But that meant Alcala got away. He winds up fleeing to upstate New York, where he's found working in an all-girls summer school camp, where essentially he was on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list. He was going to NYU Film School because, of course, he'd graduated from UCLA Film School, and he was operating under the alias of John Berger. So two of these girls go to the post office to mail a letter, and they see Rodney Alcala's picture under the name of, Rodney Alcala. And they're like, "Hey, that's Mr. Berger. He works at the camp." So that's how he got caught. So he comes back to California. They extradite him back to California, and they try him for the kidnapping of Tali Shapiro. And he received a life sentence at that. Okay, so they could have kept him in custody for life. Now, he kidnapped an 8-year-old girl and he raped her. He did 34 months in California State Prison for that, and they released him. People like Rodney Alcala, when they get out, they're going to kill other people. Sex offenders do not get better. Okay, all the treatment in the world does not fix sex offenders. So if you release violent sex offenders like Rodney Alcala, at the very least, they're going to commit additional rapes or child molestations. But what happens is a lot of them learn that by leaving the victim alive, they face greater legal jeopardy. So it's way more convenient for them to kill them. And we've seen that over and over again in Southern California. And of course, Rodney Alcala is a sadistic serial murderer. So he got off on the infliction of pain, and he was going to kill Tali Shapiro had he not been interrupted by the heroic police officer and the Good Samaritan. I have no idea what the parole board was thinking. They're looking at this guy. He kidnapped, raped, and almost murdered an 8-year-old little girl who was a stranger. It wasn't even somebody that lived in his house. This was a girl walking down the street. That is as predatory, pathological, and psychotic as you can possibly get. And they released him after 34 months. He had a life sentence. They released him after 34 months. And that is a lesson that everybody can learn from now, because like I said, the pendulum is starting to swing more towards early release. It's a pretty simple formula. Kidnapper, rapist, psycho, near murderer of an 8-year-old girl, probably not the guy you want to release after 34 months. So he got some therapy in prison. They figured he's good now. They released him. And remember, that was in 1974. Virtually every one of our murders, someone predating that in New York, every one of the murders that we prosecuted were after he was released. It's pretty awful. We always suspected there had to be more with Rodney Alcala because he was released in 1974, and our murder didn't take place until 1979. His whole MO was he'd approach these young women and say, "Hey, you could be a model," or "I'm in a photography contest." And he would use photography as a way to lure them into vulnerable positions with him, either take him out of the woods or get him into his car. That was kind of his ongoing shtick. He approached Robin and her friend, who was also 12 years old. They were sunbathing on Huntington Beach right before Robin's ballet lesson. And he said, "Hey, I'm in a photography contest. Will you allow me to take your picture?" And so he did his deal. So this photographer was a suspect right away because 45 minutes later, Robin disappeared and was never seen again. This person that approached them was always a suspect. So they asked Robin's friend to do a composite. For a 12-year-old girl, the composite is fantastic. This was a big deal media-wise because we had a missing 12-year-old girl. Alcala's parole officer saw the composite on TV, and he called detectives and said, "You guys need to check out Rodney Alcala. It looks like him. It sounds like him. You got to look at Rodney Alcala." And like 15 minutes after they received that phone call, one of the cops is home, turns on the TV, and sees Alcala on the dating game. So that's how that thing broke down. So he gets arrested, and then we got into the storage locker and found all of the photographs. So he'd been traveling also across the United States, and of course, since our case, he's been linked and convicted of several murders in New York. There was a recent one in North Dakota. There was one in Wyoming. There's one out of Marin, all based on these photographs, because these family members have seen the pictures for their missing loved ones. And if a photograph of a missing young woman is in Rodney Alcala's storage locker, I guarantee they're dead. That he raped them, he murdered them, he tortured them, and they were dead. So given the volume of the photographs, we always knew that we had other victims. We didn't know who they were. There's thousands of photographs of young women and young boys and adult women, young girls, that to this day, we've been unable to identify many of them. So being alone in the company of Rodney Alcala, knowing what he did to Robin Samsoe, knowing what he did to Tally Shapiro, we always suspected that there were more victims. I mean, in fact, to a pretty high degree of certainty, we knew he'd killed other people. We just didn't know who they were and couldn't prove it. So what happens is, it lands on my desk, and I sat down with my boss, so it's been twice gutted, and we figure there was an informant involved in the second prosecution that I was not going to touch. Okay, so it was very thin. Now, absolutely no question in our minds that Rodney did it, that Alcala was guilty of the murder of Robin Samsoe. So it's one of those interesting moments as a prosecutor where it's like, okay, this case is going to be very difficult, but if this guy's going to ever be free again, I would much rather, he's basically going to have to do it over my dead body. So we made the decision, we're going to prosecute it no matter what. We're not going to release him. We're not going to roll over with the Ninth Circuit's ruling on this. We're going to prosecute him with whatever evidence we have left. Okay. Now, it's called a return unremitted, which is the procedural step when the court orders you to release him or try him within a certain period of time. No sooner is the ink dry on that, we start getting our cold hit DNA cases out of LA. So we make this decision, we're going to prosecute him no matter what, and then the good news starts. It's horrific because there are, of course, other victims, but it's good news for us because it means that we now have a whole new body of evidence from which to prosecute Rodney Alcala. There's a penal code section here in California, Penal Code Section 790, that allows you to do multi-jurisdictional prosecution. So in other words, if a serial killer kills multiple women in multiple jurisdictions, he doesn't get a separate trial for each one because he's in a different county, which is a very wise thing for the California State Legislature to have done, but it had just never been tested before. So we went all the way to the California Supreme Court on that. And I went up and I met with Steve Cooley up in LA, who was the DA. And I'd been talking to the DA up there, Gina Satriano, who I love. And it's like, hey, why don't we do it together? And so Cooley, in a great move, decided that was the best thing to do. So he blessed Gina and I's thought that let's do this together as one big case instead of breaking it up into a bunch of small cases. So we teamed up on that, and it was actually one of the best experiences of my career, working with Gina Satriano from the LADA's office. There's no free murders. There's no freebie. If somebody kills 10 people and there's an 11th out there that's really hard, we don't give them a freebie and just go with the 10. We hold them accountable for every single person they kill. And it's more work for the prosecution, it's more work for the police, but to a man and woman, the police who we've worked on this, they understand. People are happy to do the work if we can bring justice to the families. So it's every one that we can get them on, we're going to try them on. There were 4 unsolved murders out of LA County. There was Jill Barkham, who was found on a fire road up in the mountains above Hollywood. There was Georgia Wickstead, who was a beautiful young woman who just moved into her own apartment in Malibu. There was Charlotte Lamb, who was another woman who had moved here from the Midwest, absolutely gorgeous and a sweetheart of a person. She was found in a laundry room in an apartment complex in the city of El Segundo. And then we had Jill Parenteau, who lived in Burbank, who frequented a bar that Rodney Alcala would go to. So we had these 4 murders. Now, 3 of them we had really good DNA. We had Georgia Wickstead was brutalized. He raped her, he bashed her head in with a hammer. And one of the things that was consistent with all of Rodney Alcala's rapes and murders is that His semen was located in every orifice and virtually every inch of the body of these poor women. So these were long, ongoing, torturous murders and rapes, where his MO basically was he would use multiple ligatures, he would strangle them into the point of unconsciousness, and then allow them to regain consciousness, and then torture them some more. So that was his process. With every one of them, we had multiple samples of semen, basically. So the DNA, the hits that we had on all of them except for one, were excellent. It was 1 in a trillion. There was no question it was Rodney Alcala. There's no question what he did. The more difficult one was on Jill Parento. That was the tough one because what happened was after he was convicted, they charged him with that. After he was convicted of the original Robin Samsoe murder in 1980, Burbank Police Department wound up losing a bunch of the evidence. So they either lost it or threw it away. But anyway, we lost all of the semen samples. We lost all the swabs. So what we had is we had old-fashioned serology. They had a blood sample, and that was basically it. So it was a much more of a what you call a circumstantial case on that, but it was still overwhelming. So that one was actually very important because she was such a nice young woman, and her family is still alive. All of them had family that was still alive, and they were all, to a person, as nice as could be. So you really, as a prosecutor, you want to bring them justice, as corny as that sounds. And they had been waiting for decades, these people. So the news for them is, number one, the person that murdered their loved one was identified, and then the next step is, can we bring justice to them? On the serial killers, especially the rapists, they'll keep a little keepsake, they'll keep a trophy. And we had a silk pouch with all kinds of unidentified jewelry in there, stuff that we still to this day have no idea where it came from or who the jewelry belonged to. But we do know that there was a set of earrings in there that Robin Samsoe's mother identified as giving to her daughter, but there was another earring, and those earrings had been the subject of this litigation for decades. The Ninth Circuit actually allowed destructive testing of one of them without a provision that DNA be taken first. So imagine that. In the modern era, they said, go ahead, you can melt that earring and determine the metallurgical content of it, but don't worry about a DNA swab. That happened on this case. So one of our 2 earrings is melted down. Very quietly on an evidence shelf is another little rose earring that nobody worried about, that nobody did anything. Rodney said that it was his, and we tested that, and we got 0.06 nanograms of DNA belonging to Charlotte Lamb. So when we're in that courtroom, it's almost like Charlotte Lamb is whispering from the grave to our jury, Robin's mother was right. Rodney Alcala keeps earrings. You know, I mean, it was the most powerful evidence you could ever hope, and just this tiny little piece of DNA that sat there for decades, and you know, technology caught up to it, thank God. And that was sort of an emotional part of the trial, you know, when the jury got to realize that Robin's mother, after all of these years and after all of these cross-examinations, was conclusively proven to be right by the DNA of Charlotte Lamb on another earring found in the exact same pouch as the ones that Robin was wearing that day. Robin's mother, her credibility is questioned. And here, the third time around, Rodney Alcala is representing himself. So she's getting cross-examined by the murderer of her daughter, who's calling her a liar. I mean, imagine that. One of the curious things about these serial killers, and you look at Ted Bundy, he did the exact same thing. They all believe they're smarter than everybody else, so they all want to represent themselves. And fortunately, every one of them is also a terrible trial lawyer. I think whatever it is that allows you to disconnect, to be able to torture and murder people to get off on that, also disconnects them from ever being able to read a room. They can't understand what a jury is thinking. Like the cross-examination of Robin Samsoe's mother alienated every juror. You know, I mean, it was absurd. But because he's a serial killer, because he's a psychopath, he doesn't get that. On one hand, it was like, oh man, we're gonna have to deal with this guy. On the other, it's like, okay, this is fantastic because, you know, you can't claim ineffective assistance of counsel on appeal. They're all terrible lawyers. And so it was, you know, tactically, it was the best thing that could happen for the case. It became far less sterile for us as prosecutors because we had to talk to them every day. We had to deal with them and we had to interact with them. It made it kind of, for lack of a better term, gross. But it was, it's all about the victims' families. It's all about these young women that have been murdered. So it's the best thing that could happen for our case. This guy, remember, he grew up in a family where his mother loved him. He was a handsome kid in high school. He had girlfriends, he had friends. He was on the yearbook committee, you know. He was a cross-country letterman for varsity cross-country. He was an athlete. He went to UCLA Film School, studied under Roman Polanski. Women liked him, men liked him. He was charming as could be, just like Ted Bundy. You know, he was charming. He had a genius level IQ. So he's a smart, engaging guy. And you got to deal with them. And the thing is that if you go in as a prosecutor with the idea that I'm gonna fight this guy every day, I'm gonna combat him, it's very easy to lose the big picture. So for the sake of the jury and for the sake of the judge, who I have tremendous respect for, as a professional, you've got to go in and you've got to, I never shook his hand, but you've got to deal with him and you've got to engage him in conversation and you've got to talk to him. And what I saw when I dealt with him is I could see how every one of these young women would get in the car because he was so intelligent. He was a handsome guy, not by the time we got to him, but back then, all that, you could see how this very intelligent, very charming, very handsome guy could lure these women into positions of vulnerability where he could rape them and murder them. Like you could see it. It makes no sense until you actually deal with the guy. I understood then how he won the dating game, you know, and how he would get accepted to film school, and you know, it all kind of made sense when you actually had to sit down and talk to the guy. Another thing that was interesting was there was a moment in between when the court was off the bench when I'm just talking to Rodney, and I asked him, because we have death row in California, and I've got a lot of death penalty cases, and I've got a bunch of people that I've sent up to death row, and I wanted to learn about it. So I asked him, you know, what's it like up there? How do you deal with these really heavy gang members? You know, some of these guys that we send up to death row in California. And he looked at me and he said, and this is when he thinks I'm his buddy, right? So he's like, he goes, we have 6 yards. He goes, they have a softy yard, basically. They call it the weenie yard. And he goes, Matt, called me Matt, I'm not violent. I'm not a violent guy. I'm on the weenie yard. I'm not with those guys. I'm not violent. This is a guy who raped and bashed the skull in of Georgia Wickstead. You know, this is a guy who smashed the face in of Jill Parkham with a rock, and he's looking at me like, hey buddy, I'm not violent. I'm not on that yard with those guys. I'm with the respectable guys on death row. You know, that was a moment I will also never forget. After my closing argument, that's when he realized, after I pointed at him and called him the devil, he realized I wasn't his buddy. It was actually it's fascinating dealing with the guy. It really was. I'd be lying if I said anything. It was repulsive. He's, you know, knowing what he did, but in that environment, it's like looking at a poisonous spider under glass. You can't harm anybody in the courtroom. Another interesting dynamic was Alfredo Rausch was the court-appointed investigator, who is a great guy, consummate professional, hardworking guy. He works for the courts, and he became the assigned investigator. He had these 2 very pretty assistants that were both young women. Another story I probably shouldn't tell about this. They were also very professional, but Alcala, it's all his whole world, you know, and remember, he's been in prison. So now he has an opportunity to interact with pretty young women again. And you would see him almost ignoring Alfredo, who is the professional, and he would want these assistants. Like, I want you to copy this, I want you to do this. And you'd see him just focusing on them. And they couldn't stand the guy, you know, for a variety of reasons, but they hated him. And when I finished my closing argument, I looked into the gallery, and the first person I saw was one of these assistants who is working for the defense and did a very professional, competent job, but looked at me and gave me a double thumbs up. You know, that was something else I will never forget. What his defense was, it was interesting. For the LA cases that he couldn't fight, the DNA ones, he didn't even want to address them. So he decided he was going to mount no defense to that at all. His whole thing was Robin Samsoe, how he had been railroaded for Robin Samsoe. His whole thing was that the earrings that were found did not belong to her, that Robin Samsoe's mother was a liar. It was essentially a version of the same defense that had been run the first 2 times, that he did not murder Robin Samsoe. He wrote a book that it was used actually a university in Chicago about how he'd been railroaded by the American criminal justice system. And there were professors that actually had their students buying Rodney Alcala's book. It was called You, the Jury, and it was this It read like stereo instructions, but it was Rodney explaining how he had been falsely convicted of the murder of Robin Samsoe. So his whole focus was on Robin Samsoe. For his closing argument, the argument that he wanted to make was, ladies and gentlemen, if you kill me, you're murderers, okay, which is awesomely ironic, right? But to illustrate the point, there's an old 1960s war protest song by a guy named Arlo Guthrie. It's called Alice's Restaurant. So he played Alice's Restaurant in his closing, and there's a line in there that said, I want to feel veins in my teeth, I want to kill, shrink, I want to kill, I want to kill, I want to kill. He played that and he said, ladies and gentlemen, if you vote to execute me, you're just like the guy in the song. Meanwhile, our judge was a war hero from Vietnam. And at sentencing, Francisco Briceño, who never commented on sentencing, said, Mr. Alcala, sir, I didn't listen to a whole lot of war protesting songs because I was in Vietnam fighting for my country. But I have no doubt that every time you murdered one of these young women, that was the song that was playing in your head. You know, so that was absolutely fascinating. The jury convicted him of the murder of Robin Samsoe, and also, thankfully, the murder of Jill Barkham, the murder of Jill Parenteau, the murder of Georgia Wickstead, and the murder of Charlotte Lamb. So he was convicted of everything we charged him with. Every single victim, every single count, it was a clean sweep. And then the jury came back, I believe it was about 2.5 hours, they returned a verdict of death. But for these families to hear the jury come back and say your loved one was so valuable that this man deserves to die for what he did, that is an incredibly cathartic experience for them. It really is. And so the families, the jury came back, the families, everybody was crying. You know, we had the jury, we brought them downstairs so they could talk to the family members and the family members could thank them, and everybody's crying, and it's a very gratifying experience as a prosecutor, especially having worked so well, I think, with my colleague Gina Satriano from the LADA's office. That was a good moment. And for these psychopaths, their main thing, they want to control things. They want to be in control, they want the attention on them. That's kind of what drives them. And Rodney had a negative experience at the end. When the jury rejected everything that he had to say, I think that was great for the victims. And I think that, it's sort of his last hurrah is a jury coming back, which at that point was the fastest death penalty verdict in the history of our county. So he went up, he made his whole pitch, and they soundly rejected him. They rejected his defense. They rejected everything that he stood for and found that he deserved to die for what he did. But just to have him have to listen to that jury reject him and everything that he had to say was a very good moment for the victims' families. Well, Rodney Alcala is, first of all, he is a highly intelligent, charming, psychopathic, murderous, torturous killer. He is somebody that never should have had the opportunity to do what he did. The California justice system could have kept him in custody. The California parole boards could have made sure that none of these people were murdered. They decided to release him instead, and it's a tragedy. It really is. It's a tragedy. It's heartbreaking, especially when you deal with victims' families. But Rodney Alcala is one of the most interesting cases I've ever gotten to do. He's one of the most interesting defendants I've ever gotten to deal with. And thank God the jury did the right thing, found him accountable, convicted him, and sentenced him to death. I think the day he rots away and finally dies will be a good day for the whole world.
Rodney Alcala died of a heart attack in July 2021. He was 77 years old. We hope you enjoyed this interview with Matt Murphy and how he sparred in the courtroom with infamous serial killer Rodney Alcala. For more content like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button down below. We're uploading exclusive content every week, so make sure to click the notification bell so you don't miss out. Until next time.